December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, 7:55 a.m. The Japanese came in waves, and 1,512 sailors aboard the USS Arizona didn't know they had 13 minutes to live. Most of them would never know what hit them. What they also didn't know: a single bomb would kill 1,177 of them. Nearly 48% of all American military deaths at Pearl Harbor in one catastrophic moment. One ship, one bomb, one explosion lasting 7 seconds. By 8:06 a.m., that moment had arrived. The Pennsylvania-class battleship Arizona stood at her moorage along Ford Island, bristling with 12 14-inch guns, armored in 13.5 inches of steel, displacing nearly 30,000 tons. On paper, she was formidable, theoretically unsinkable. Officers like Captain Franklin van Valkenburg believed the Arizona could defend herself against anything the enemy threw at her. Rear Admiral Isaac Campbell Kidd stood on the bridge with the same confidence. They had armor. They had firepower. They had men who would fight. They had none of what they needed. At 8:06 a.m., a 1,757-pound armor-piercing bomb, modified from a Japanese naval shell, struck the starboard side of the forecastle deck adjacent to Turret 2. The bomb had been dropped from 10,480 feet by Lieutenant Shojiro Kondo aboard a Nakajima B-5N2 Kate dive bomber, one of 10 bombers from the Japanese aircraft carriers Kaga and Hiryu. It should have been stopped by the armored deck. Navy calculations insisted it would be. The bomb descended at lethal velocity, striking at an angle that defied probability, glancing off sloping armor and deflecting beneath the deck to the heart of the ship. 7 seconds later, the forward magazines detonated. Not gradually, not progressively, all at once. 582 tons of smokeless cordite powder igniting in a chain reaction that vented through the sides of the hull and collapsed the bridge forward, tearing the ship in two. Most of the crew died in those 7 seconds. Over 900 servicemen remain entombed inside that wreck to this day. This is how 1,177 men died in an instant. This is their story. 3 hours before the explosion, Joe George woke in his bunk aboard the USS Vestal, a repair ship moored directly alongside the Arizona. He was reading a Sunday newspaper when the general quarters alarm shattered the morning silence at 7:55 a.m. George wasn't supposed to be there. He was confined to ship, facing summary court-martial for a fight during a boxing match at a Navy recreation center 2 days earlier. While other sailors had liberty ashore, George was trapped below decks, unaware that his punishment had just become irrelevant. By 8:06 a.m., as the Arizona's magazine detonated, the concussion force was so violent it extinguished fires that had just erupted on the Vestal. The blast wave threw men across decks. Debris rained down, fire roared across the water, and burning oil spread like liquid hell. On the Arizona's anti-aircraft gun platform, 80 feet above the water, directly above the collapsing bridge, 6 men clung to handholds among flames and thick smoke. All were severely burned. The platform itself was beginning to collapse. Every second, the fire spread closer. From the Vestal's deck, an officer screamed at George to cut the mooring lines. If the Vestal didn't separate, both ships would sink together. It was protocol. It was rational. It was an order. George refused. The officer repeated it. George ignored him. Instead, he found a weighted heaving line on the Vestal's deck and threw it toward the trapped Arizona crewmen. The men secured it. They began crawling hand over hand across 70 to 80 feet of open space while Japanese fighter planes dove through the smoke, strafing the water and the burning oil below them. Each man was burned. Each movement was agony. Each second was potentially their last. This act of defiance, refusing a direct order to save 6 lives, would define the rest of Joe's life. But at that moment, he didn't know he was making history. He just knew 6 men would die if he obeyed. One of those 6 was Seaman First Class Donald Stratton. Stratton was burned over 80% of his body. What saved the USS Vestal while destroying the Arizona came down to proximity and armor. The Vestal was a repair ship, lightly armed, designed for maintenance work, not combat. It carried minimal ammunition and no powder magazines. When the Arizona's explosion detonated, the Vestal took the blast wave, but not the lethal venting of magazine pressure that destroyed her neighbor. The Arizona had no such mercy built into her design. The 1,757-pound armor-piercing bomb that struck Turret 2 had calculated a trajectory for something impossible. It shouldn't have penetrated the 13.5 inches of armor protecting the forward deck. Navy engineers had designed the ship assuming that thickness would stop almost anything the Japanese could throw at it. They calculated for direct hits. They calculated for glancing blows. They calculated for the bomb to detonate on the armored surface, its force dissipating across the steel rather than through it. But the bomb wasn't at terminal velocity when it struck. Dropped from 10,480 feet, it hadn't accelerated to maximum speed. It hit at an angle that allowed physics to betray the Arizona's designers. The bomb glanced off the sloping armor around Turret 2 and deflected aft beneath the deck, penetrating 5.62 inches of the main armor belt, plus 4 additional decks of lighter steel before reaching the powder magazines below. That penetration violated everything the Navy believed about battleship protection. Yet it happened in seconds, and there was nothing the engineers' calculations could do about it after the fact. The starboard powder magazine for the 14-inch guns detonated first. Approximately 582 tons of smokeless cordite powder stored in silk bags. The explosion wasn't a single violent burst. It was a sequence. The starboard detonation filled compartments with superheated, expanding gases. These gases raced forward at lethal speed, striking a 13-inch thick armored bulkhead protecting the forward magazine spaces. The pressure deflected upward through 3 decks, venting forward of Turret 1 in a visible fireball that lasted half a second. It was the prelude. The real destruction was about to begin. The portside magazines ignited as the starboard explosion was still echoing. With all surrounding voids already filled with superheated, expanding gases from the starboard detonation, the portside powder magazines had nowhere to vent but upward, outward, and forward. The result was not a secondary explosion, it was the catastrophic climax. The blast broke through remaining horizontal structures and hull plating above the 13.5-inch armored belt. The force was so great it tore the ship structurally in half. The bridge collapsed forward into the flaming cavity where the forward sections had been. The Arizona's foremast and funnel collapsed forward as well. Turrets and conning tower dropped downward 25 to 30 feet, entire structures folding into the void created by the exploding magazines. The superstructure, which moments before had stood proud above the deck, now sagged inward like a broken spine. The entire sequence, from starboard detonation to port detonation to final structural collapse, took less than 7 seconds from the moment the bomb struck. Most of the 1,177 men who died aboard the Arizona were killed in that initial magazine chain reaction. They didn't suffer prolonged deaths. They died instantaneously, their bodies vaporized or crushed as the ship torn itself apart around them. Some were in the forward compartments when the magazines detonated and were simply consumed by expanding gases. Others were topside and were thrown overboard by the blast wave or buried beneath collapsing structures. A few made it to the water and drowned as the ship sank. The ship sank within 9 minutes of the bomb strike. By then, the destruction was complete. The Arizona listed heavily to port, then rolled over. The superstructure struck the harbor bottom. The hull settled into the mud. What remained was a grave. A wreck 608 feet long, 97 feet wide, holding the bodies of more than 900 servicemen who would never leave that sunken hulk. The oil from her fuel tanks would leak for decades, a wound that never fully healed. Donald Stratton, burned over 80% of his body, shouldn't have survived the rope crossing. As he crawled hand over hand across 75 feet of flaming water, with Japanese fighter planes strafing the oil below, Joe George yelled down to him, "Come on, kid, you can do it." Stratton's muscles screamed. His burned skin cracked with every movement, but he kept crawling. Somehow, he reached the Vestal's deck alive. 5 other men crossed that rope with him. 4 survived the initial rescue. 2 would die at the hospital from complications of their burns over the following weeks. 3 lived. Stratton was one of them. Donald Stratton spent the next 74 years telling his story. He survived amputation surgeries, months of hospitalization, and decades of living in a body scarred by flames. He became a public speaker, gave interviews, and authored the memoir, All the Gallant Men, the only first-hand survivor account written by an Arizona crew member who lived through the explosion itself. In interviews and speeches, Stratton repeatedly said the same thing. Joe George deserved the Navy Cross for what he did that morning. The Navy never gave George the Navy Cross. For 68 years, George received only a commendation on his continuous service certificate, official recognition that meant almost nothing. No ceremony, no public acknowledgement, no medal. His own children didn't know what their father had accomplished. George went to his grave in 1996, believing his act of heroism had been forgotten by everyone except the handful of men he'd saved. Stratton outlived George. He continued telling anyone who would listen about the man from the Vestal who had refused orders and thrown a rope to 6 burning sailors. Stratton died in 2015, having spent more than 70 decades preserving the memory of Joe George's defiance. But Stratton's survival was extraordinary. Of approximately 1,512 men aboard the Arizona, only around 335 initially survived the attack. Of those 335, only 5 were documented as Arizona crew members who lived into old age. Stratton was one of 5. The Arizona's loss was nearly total. The handful who survived carried the weight of the 1,177 who didn't. While Stratton lived to tell George's story, there were others who left no story at all. 63 brothers served aboard the USS Arizona. They had enlisted during the Depression when poverty left families desperate. When one brother made the ship, younger brothers requested to join him. The Navy, recognizing that family ties boosted morale in wartime, accommodated these requests. 23 complete sets of brothers died simultaneously in the 7-second explosion. 3 of those sets had 3 brothers each. The Murdoch brothers, Thomas Daniel, Charles Luther, and Melvin Elijah, had all enlisted together from northern Alabama farmland. Thomas was 21 when he first joined in spring 1930. His brothers followed years later. All 3 were aboard when the magazine detonated. All 3 died in the same explosion that killed 1,177 men. The Becker brothers and Doherty brothers died the same way. Entire family lines eliminated in an instant while their parents waited at home for letters that would never arrive. But the Anderson twins tell a different story. John Willard Anderson and Delibert were caught in separate evacuation boats during the chaos. John refused to leave. He said to the officers forcing him, "I can't go. My brother's up there." Officers grabbed him and forced him into the lifeboat anyway. After reaching Ford Island, John returned to search for Delibert among the flames and wreckage. He returned multiple times. He never found Delibert. John lived. Delibert died. John Anderson became the only Arizona brother who witnessed his sibling's death but couldn't save him. A burden he carried for the rest of his life.
Of all 63 brothers who died aboard the Arizona, only 4 identified brothers were ever recovered from the wreck. This means 59 complete brother sets remain entombed inside that hull, their bodies never recovered, their families never receiving remains to bury. In some cases, families never received confirmation of which compartment had claimed their sons. The Navy later issued a bulletin advising against family members serving on the same ship, but the bulletin had no teeth. No formal regulation followed. Even after the Sullivan brothers died aboard USS Juneau in 1942, the Navy did not implement strict policy. Brothers continued to volunteer to serve together. They chose family loyalty over survival odds. How did the explosion kill so thoroughly and so fast? The answer lay hidden in physics, in the steel itself, in evidence that wouldn't be fully understood for 55 years after the attack. When the 1,757-pound bomb struck adjacent to Turret 2 at 8:06 a.m., It should have been stopped by the 13.5 inches of armored deck. Navy calculations insisted the armor should have detonated the bomb on impact, dissipating its force across the steel rather than through it. But the bomb wasn't at terminal velocity. It had been dropped from too high to accelerate fully. It struck at a precise angle that allowed it to glance off the sloping armor, deflect aft beneath the deck, and penetrate armor that Navy engineers believed was impenetrable. That penetration should have been theoretically impossible. It happened anyway. 55 years later, National Park Service divers examining the wreck discovered the physical proof. Navy salvage teams in 1942-1943 had found only one spent 14-inch powder can out of more than 1,000 stored in the forward powder rooms. Everything else was vaporized. The heat and pressure had consumed steel, powder, and men until almost nothing remained. But the wreck itself held a secret. The hull bore a forensic signature that told the story of the explosion sequence. The port side of the hull bulged outward significantly more than the starboard side. Physical evidence that the starboard powder magazine detonated first, with the port side explosion following milliseconds later and forced to vent more violently outward on the port side because all surrounding voids were already filled with superheated gases. The steel itself had recorded the explosion sequence like a witness frozen in time. Scientists used this evidence, the unusual hull distortions, the positioning of surviving structural elements, the vaporization patterns, to reverse engineer exactly how the chain reaction had unfolded. It took decades of analysis, forensic investigation, and diving operations to understand what had happened in 7 seconds. But when they finally understood it, they understood completely. The Arizona had been destroyed by physics, made manifest in metal and fire. But the USS Arizona's story didn't end at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. After the wreckage settled into the mud, 608 feet long and 97 feet wide, Navy crews began salvage operations in May 1942. They extracted what they could. The 2 rear turrets, turrets 3 and 4, were mostly intact, recovered and removed from the wreck. Each turret carried 3 14-inch guns. These weren't just recovered weapons. They were ghosts of the Arizona, given new life in a war that raged across the Pacific for 3 more years. Battery Arizona was established at Kahe Point on Oahu's leeward coast, overlooking 300 feet above the ocean. Battery Pennsylvania was positioned at Mokapu Point on the windward side, protecting Kaohsiung Bay. Both batteries required underground tunnels excavated from lava rock, massive concrete barbettes built to withstand aerial bombardment, radar towers, command centers, and accommodations for approximately 160 men each. The construction was enormous, undertaken as the United States fought to retake the Pacific from Japanese occupation. But Battery Arizona's construction halted in August 1945 before it was finished. Meanwhile, a third turret, turret number 2, partially submerged at the Arizona's wreck site, was salvaged separately. The guns were sent to a New York shipyard for relining and straightening, then installed into USS Nevada's turret number 1 position in fall 1944. The Nevada subsequently bombarded Japanese-held islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa throughout 1945, firing Arizona's guns into Japanese defensive positions. In August 1945, as Japan prepared to surrender, Battery Pennsylvania fired its guns in test exercises. The exact date remains disputed. Navy sources range from August 10th as late as September 2, but the significance is clear. The Arizona's guns, salvaged from her wreck, firing one final time as World War II ended. These were the Arizona's last shots. The ship that couldn't defend Pearl Harbor had defended Hawaii through her weaponry. Over 900 of her crew remained entombed beneath Pearl Harbor, but her guns fired on until the very end of the war. That was her final salvo. That was her resurrection.